October 8th, 2022, Stanford leads Oregon State 24-10 heading into the fourth quarter of a game down on the farm. The Cardinal go on to lose this game in the last 30 seconds thanks to some of the most hopeless, borderline slapstick defensive plays imaginable. I was actually at that game, sitting behind the end zone where the touchdown was scored, and to this day, I have no idea what the hell the Stanford secondary was doing here. I've seen a lot of football in my life, but nothing quite like that. Yet, a lot of Stanford fans left Stanford Stadium on this night sort of thinking, well, at least this has to be rock bottom, right?
Am I right or am I right or am I right? Right.
In fact, it did seem that way for a few weeks after the loss. The Cardinal beat Notre Dame and then Arizona State, but this was nothing more than a false dawn. Nearly 3 years after the Hail Mary loss to Oregon State, Stanford is arguably the worst Power 4 football team in all of America. You knew things were bad, but they may have even hit a new low at the start of the 2025 season when they announced Ben Gulbranson, the man who threw the game-winning Hail Mary pass for Oregon State in 2022, as their starting quarterback. The Beavers had spent 3 seasons trying to find anyone else to stick under center other than Gulbranson. No disrespect to the passer, I'm sure he's a great guy, and I'm sure he has a good mind for football, but Gulbranson is right up there neck and neck with Evan Svoboda for quarterbacks who I wouldn't wish upon my worst enemy, and that includes you, Boise State. As for Stanford, Andrew Luck is the individual tasked with turning things around in Palo Alto. The Troy Taylor experiment is over. Frank Reich is a stopgap solution. The focus now is on building a sustainable program, maybe not one that's going to contend for a national championship year over year, but one that can win 8-9 games regularly and maybe even once in a while challenge for a playoff spot. Yet, if you don't know what went wrong, it can be kind of difficult to permanently fix things. To that end, a lot of the times when people tell the tale of the fall of the Stanford Cardinal, they cite a few different reasons. It's a difficult place to recruit. Of course, you do have the academic challenges. The administration can certainly be meddlesome. These are challenges that date all the way back to the 1890s when the school first started playing football. They are also hindrances that haven't managed to derail several other coaches in the program's history. To that end, David Shaw broke Stanford football. Now, I want to stress this point because I don't want it to get lost in the shuffle. I'm not blaming David Shaw for the school's shortcomings, football-related shortcomings, that is. I don't think he knew what he was doing at the time. I don't think the school realized what was happening at the time, but make no mistake, David Shaw did break football at Stanford. You see, the thing is, football coaches do not stick around Palo Alto for a long time. Unlike other schools, well, you'll get head coaches sticking around for 10, 15, even 20 years. Turnover at Stanford over the decades has been kind of remarkable. Prior to Shaw's stint on the sidelines, no one individual was head coach of the Stanford football program for more than 9 years. And that goes all the way back to the aforementioned 1890s when Walter Camp was leading the side out. Now, there are some rugby playing years mixed in there as well, but I don't want to get sidetracked on that. If you look at the history of Stanford football coaches, you can place them in one of 3 categories. The first category are coaches who were successful and then went on to other jobs, coaches who failed and then left, either they were fired or they resigned. And then you have the third category, coaches annoyed with what the school was doing and were left or fired. No need to go over every coach here, but let's take a look at some of the highlights from each category, and we'll start with the first. John Ralston was on the farm for 9 seasons, and then he was hired by the Denver Broncos to be their head coach. Apologies in advance to Notre Dame and Washington fans, but Tyrone Willingham was at Stanford for 7 seasons before he was hired to lead the Fighting Irish. Jim Harbaugh was around for 4 seasons, and Bill Walsh stuck around for a pair of seasons in the 1970s, and both ended up hired by the San Francisco 49ers to be their head coach. Walsh also happens to appear in the second category. He returned in the 1990s, had 1 good season, 2 not so good seasons, and then just opted to retire from coaching. Tiny Thornhill lasted 7 seasons, 1 with Pop Warner's players, and then was fired after a 1-win campaign. Marchie Schwartz stuck around for 6 years at Stanford, but then was forced to resign under pressure from the administration and alumni. Walt Harris, who lasted 2 seasons in Palo Alto. Then you have those coaches who were annoyed or confused confused by what the school was doing and ended up leaving for one reason or another. The most famous example here, of course, is Pop Warner, who also spent 9 years at Stanford as the head coach. He was worried the school's newfound focus on graduate programs would make it harder to recruit and opts to head to Temple. Clark Shaughnessy was around for a pair of winning seasons, but then leaves because there were rumblings the school was going to disband football during World War II, rumblings that do come to fruition. And everywhere else you look on the list of past Stanford football coaches before David Shaw tell a similar story. Some won and went on to bigger and better things, some lost and were terminated or fired or whatever the case may be, and some just didn't quite get along with others there in Palo Alto. For most major college football playing programs, this would be seen as a huge negative, a massive cause for concern. What you want at those schools is a foundational piece, someone who becomes an institution, a coach you name your stadium after. Stanford, though, it oddly benefits from this constantly churning coach merry-go-round. As we mentioned before with Stanford, there are some unique challenges that come with being the head coach here. There are very high academic standards. There are some recruiting things you do have to navigate. But by constantly having a new coach coming in, it sort of allows your football program to have its finger on the pulse of the sport. Even the promotion of an assistant coach to the head role still gave the school a fresh perspective. It still allowed it to gain some insights and some knowledge as to what was happening in the broader scope of college football. The head coaching role is a fairly insulated one. That can prove problematic in the constantly changing world of college football. A program like Stanford needs to be at the forefront of change. It's right there in Silicon Valley, so it should be a first mover, even in something like college football. When you're a state school or even a land-grant university, you can do things how you want to do things. You can cut corners. You can be a little slower to the punch. If you're an Oklahoma or an Ohio State, you don't need to worry about having the advantage of marginal gains. You got a lot of other things already working in your favor. The marginal gains thing, as it relates to Stanford here, it comes in a few different shapes and sizes. When you look at former head coaches like Bill Walsh or Clark Shaughnessy, they brought revolutionary offenses to the school that some folks, even those on campus, were a bit skeptical of. Jim Harbaugh brought a unique man management and motivational style that worked out well for Stanford. Now, when he was first hired, there were some concerns that maybe this wouldn't translate from San Diego to Stanford. Even the coaches that ended up failing at Stanford, your Jack Elways, your Buddy Tevens, your Cactus Jack Curtises, you could still see why the school hired them in the first place. It was all to get that advantage, to do something no one else was doing. Additionally, the coaching situation at the school has ensured the proverbial cupboard of talent is never too bare for the next person in charge. As bad as the Walt Harris years were, Jim Harbaugh still inherited a team that had several players who'd go on to have NFL careers. That brings us back to David Shaw and the end of Stanford's coaching merry-go-round. Stuart Mandel and The Athletic wrote that the program sort of lost its identity. It lost its standards. Those last few seasons, no one seemed to care all that much about Stanford football. Let's be honest, as good as David Shaw was for Stanford in those first 5-6 seasons leading the team, by year 8, by year 9, he had no idea of what college football was. His finger was well off the pulse at that point. More importantly, though, every other Stanford head coach who had made it that far at the school had realized they needed some sort of change. Now, sometimes that change was of their own volition, and sometimes the change was forced upon them, but no one got to 10 seasons at Stanford. And maybe it wasn't necessarily intentional, but it worked out well for the Cardinal. Yet for whatever reason, Shaw was allowed to carry on for additional seasons in which the football program was cut further adrift from modern college football, and talent left at an alarming rate. Troy Taylor was unable to reverse this trend. In fact, it seemed that talent ebbed further and the Cardinal looked even further lost under his reign. In some ways, the plight of Stanford football in the past 5, 6, 7 years mirrors that of a flagging tech startup, something along the lines of, let's say, Netscape Navigator. Early on, Netscape Navigator was amazing. It may not have had the advantages of Internet Explorer, but I'll be damned if Netscape didn't compete and was arguably a better product, or at the very least did more with fewer resources than the big bad Microsoft competitor. Of course, Netscape does lose the plot. We get Netscape Communicator, which, that's a big thumbs down. With no solid product to build upon and no real idea of where the internet was or was going, Netscape disappears in, 98, 99? It's just gone. So how does Stanford avoid being the Netscape Navigator of college football? That is the million-dollar question. That is the question that Andrew Luck, as general manager, now finds himself needing to answer. Hiring the next coach, obviously a huge decision for any college football program out there, and there are a few different avenues Stanford can take in that regard. The big thing here, though, is they need someone who understands modern college football, where college football is at in 2025, and then adapt it to Stanford. You can't do things other schools are doing in the world of college football at Stanford, and that is a challenge, but it shouldn't be used as an excuse because, as we've seen in the past, other college football coaches have come in and had success at Stanford despite those very challenges. It's just understanding where and how the Cardinal can succeed in this modern world we now live in as it relates to college football. Other than that, I guess Luck and everyone at Stanford really need to sell recruits not just to come to Palo Alto, but being there for 3 or 4 seasons. This is a place where talent develops, where players really truly need to be patient to become the best versions of themselves. You can't just come in and think, well, I'm going to start as a freshman and do all that. And you can't have players coming in thinking that. Now, there can be roles, there can be opportunity for freshmen to play, but really the idea for Stanford has to be, it's not about what you're at as a freshman or a sophomore, but what you're going to become as a junior and potentially a senior, how you're going to develop into that potential NFL prospect, as well as all of the other benefits that come with attending Stanford. Given all of the examples of football players who've done that very thing while attending Stanford, along with the growing number of transfers who are just flaming out spectacularly, going from school to school to school in search of something that doesn't exist, this may actually be a unique selling point Stanford can use to help it rebuild its talent base. Is it enough to convince a 16 or 17-year-old not just to commit for a season, but to stay the course? I mean, who really knows in this day and age? But I think it's something Stanford needs to do a better job of. I think under Troy Taylor especially, you sort of saw it was just about getting kids in there. It wasn't about finding kids willing to stick it out and sort of understand how Stanford works from a football playing standpoint. At the end of the day, though, history shows Stanford isn't successful when it's trying to do the same thing as everyone else, nor does it thrive when the status quo is maintained. Everything has a shelf life in Silicon Valley, and that includes college football and college football head coaches. Thank you for watching this video. If you'd like to know the wild story of college football in Alaska, check out the video in the upper left-hand corner of your screen. And for the complete history of the Kibbe Dome, Idaho's beloved domed home, check out the video in the lower left-hand corner. Until next time, I am Cheyenne Hollis. This is The Touchback, and as always, hashtag take it out to the 25.